Great. Thanks, Vivek. Thanks for giving me that introduction. And thanks everyone for showing up on a Saturday evening. So, so the topic for today is a tour on optimization. So there are two words that I used in the topic. One is a deep tour because though I'm going to talk about several topics, I want to make sure that I also get into a little bit of math involved in these topics, and also a lot of intuition around the mathematical equations. That's going to be the flavor of the session. And I also kind of introduced the word whirlwind because the topics that I'm going to introduce today are by themselves very, very deep. And I'm going to take an assemblage of 7 or 8 topics. And I'm going to show a lot of intuition behind them and how these things are used practically also. Some kind of a brainstorming, intuitive brainstorming, you could say. Now, the topics that I'm going to present today are, first of all, there's a lot of foundational stuff that is needed to understand a few of these topics later. So we'll start with a little bit of foundations, and then we'll talk about linear programming. Some of us would have taken operations research subjects either in degree or maybe later. And then we would have also dealt a little bit with mixed integer linear programming. So I'm going to start very simply with what do they mean? How does an optimization problem get formulated? And then slowly I'm going to get into the nonlinear programming side, the nonlinear optimization side. Here we'll use all the foundational pieces that we have already would have reviewed, and then slowly we'll get into evolutionary optimization and then multi-objective, and actually Bayesian optimization will be the one that we'll cover at the last. So we'll kind of have a good idea about what these different flavors of optimization methods mean at the end of this session. Again, as I said, these topics are by themselves very, very deep. There are multiple ways of modeling, innumerable number of modeling tricks, lot of different solution strategies, and a lot of different modeling strategies. So once in one session we cannot do justice to all of them, but I think it's a good start where we can introduce a lot of these topics. And while probably talking about Bayesian, we'll also look at how the exploration exploitation trade-off happens, which we generally associate with reinforcement learning kind of stuff. Let's start with some foundations here. Okay, the first thing that we need to understand is the kind of functions that we would like to approximate. Some of them could be convex, though in real world convexity is, yeah, I mean, it's not something that is highly prevalent. But especially in the deep learning world, we deal a lot with the non-convex surfaces. But let's get into what is convexity, what is concavity, a little bit of definition. So the x-axis, as you see in one of these, the left-hand side diagram here. So if you take a point A, the function evaluation y is equal to f of a is given in the dotted line. Similarly, there is a point B for this curve, which can be evaluated y is equal to f of b. Now you can actually take a small variable t, which actually lies within 0 and 1, in such a way that t times a plus 1 minus t times b falls somewhere in the middle. Depending on the value of t, this point can be anywhere in the middle, here in the x-axis. Now, if you want to actually take the similarly y is equal to f of x, where x is equal to this point, ta plus 1 minus t times b, then you will again get a corresponding corresponding f of ta plus 1 minus t times b. Okay, so what is a convex function? A convex function is defined as one where your f of this point, which is inside any two given points, I mean any point that is a linear combination of two extremes. Are you able to hear me okay? Are you able to hear me okay?
All good. All good. Everything is fine. That
Awesome.
formula you are showing, by the way, it is the averaging formula. So t would have to be a fraction, isn't it?
Correct. It should be
The
between 0 to 1.
t has to be a fraction, and so that would be an averaging formula when you apply it like that. ta plus
Correct.
1 minus tb. So based on value of t, you are taking different proportion of a and b, right?
Right. And it can fall anywhere in this curve. So the idea of
Right.
complexity is, yeah, depending on the values of t, and so t and 1 minus t are related. If t is like 0.3, 1 minus t will be like 0.7. Depending on t, you can actually surf through this whole curve within this a and b limits. But when you surf through a curve that way, if your function at this evaluated point, if it is always lesser than this particular value, t times f of a plus 1 minus t times f of b, which basically means to say that you take this point f of a right here, the evaluated point at a, and this point f of b right here, the evaluated point at b, and if you actually take a linear combination of those points with t and 1 minus t, you will get a certain point. Now that point will always be greater than, will always be above this function. If that happens, then this function is actually a convex function. So if the opposite happens, then the curve is probably concaving downwards. So this is actually called a concave function. Now, why is this important? Lot of good properties exist for convex functions. For example, if you find a local minima in a convex function, then you can say, you can be assured that that is going to be your global minimum. But seldom this happens. In real world cases, mostly it is all nonlinear, non-convex surfaces. For example, in deep learning, it's a highly nonlinear, non-convex surface. So if you find a local minima, you cannot be assured that that is a global minimum. But concavity actually helps in finding out the global minima for certain kind of modeling problems. This is very important concept to know, very foundational.
In left one, we'll be using gradient descent. In right one, we'll be using gradient ascent, called maximum likelihood estimation, right?
Right, you can basically use any of the, there are a bunch of things that you can use. There is so gradient descent is one thing. You can use Newton-Raphson, you can use quasi-Newton, you can use BFGS. There are a bunch of you can even use a simple line search. There are a bunch of algorithms that you can use to actually navigate through this whole function. But I'm in this talk, I'm not going to go too much into how we are going to navigate, but I'm going to rather give the very central idea behind a lot of these functions. Okay. So yeah, so the other very important aspects that we would like to understand is, suppose we have a gradient of a certain function, let's say f dash of x, and we've got certain equation for that gradient. If you actually map that gradient to 0, which basically means that we are trying to investigate whether we have reached a maxima or a minima, and we have some function like this. Suppose if we want to evaluate this function at a point, let's say x is equal to 1. Let me start from the second block here. Let's say I'm trying to evaluate this as x is equal to 1. So I differentiate my gradient. So this is what we call as Hessian. So the differential derivative of the gradient is the Hessian. The Jacobian is the Hessian. So when you actually differentiate this, you get this equation, very simple calculus. And if you actually substitute 1 instead of x star, you get a value minus 60. What this basically means is you're basically saying that, yeah, your gradient is basically 0, but then your Jacobian, the gradient is actually 0. But then if you take the second order derivative, you're getting a negative value, which means that your function is basically curving downwards. A function will curve downwards if the only direction in which the function is curving is downwards. Then, and if your gradient is already 0 at a certain point, then it means that you're already at a local maxima. Only from a maxima you can curve downwards. If it's a minima, you would actually curve upwards. This, for example, at the point x is equal to 2, the third block here, I have a similar equation here, and you've got 240 here at x is equal to 2. So this is a positive value. Since here the second derivative is positive, now we've got a local minima with a. Now that means at this point you're already in a local minima. Now you're curving kind of upwards. So these two are very important. Now it can so happen that you can also take the second derivative and equate it at some other point. Let's say x is equal to 0. You can also take the third derivative at that same point. If that is positive, it is kind of neither a point which is maximum or minimum. It is just a point of inflection. And you'll get to know a little bit about it later. So these are some very basic concepts again to know. Okay, so this slide is pretty important again. What is a positive semi-definite, positive definite? What is a negative semi-definite, negative definite? So if you actually take a certain equation, let's say the equation represented by f of x here, I've got an equation written here. You can actually take the gradient of this function. If you take the gradient of this function with respect to x1 and with respect to x2, here, this is the equation that you will get. Again, very simple. So 2 by 3, so 2x1 cubed, so 3 to 2 is 6. 6 times x1 square divided by 3, that is 2 times x1 square. That is how you get this term. Similarly, you are differentiating with respect to x1, so minus 2 x2 will remain here, and then minus 5 will remain because it's a constant. So that's x1 here. That's x1's derivative here. Similarly, for x2 also you can derive. And if you can actually equate these two to 0, you'll actually get the two stationary points. You'll get an x1 and you'll get an x2. These stationary points have certain behaviors. So what it means is, suppose like we did, we actually took a function. We took the gradient of that function. We equated it to 0 and we got the points x1 and x2. Now we take the Hessian of it, which means that we again take the derivative dou f by dou x1 of dou f by dou x1. So we take this particular thing and we again differentiate with respect to x1, which means you'll get 4x1 here because 2 into 2 is 4x1. Here there is no x1 term. Here also there's no x1 term, so it's all becomes 0. In terms of x2, dou f by dou x2 square, there is no x2 term in the first and the third terms in this term, and then there is 4x2, so you get a 4 here. And similarly, you've got minus 2 for x1 and minus 2 for x2. These are your Hessian values. You can actually put them into a matrix and say that dou f by dou square f by dou x1 square is this term. Dou square f by dou x2 square is this term, and these are the off diagonal terms, which are dou square f by dou x1 dou x2.
Actually,
So
yeah, I got lost here a little bit. What is Hessian again? I've seen that, but keep forgetting it.
Sure. Hessian is just the derivative of your gradient function. It's kind of the second derivative. So f of x is this function. Yeah, this function. We got its derivative here. You again differentiate these two terms with respect to x1 and x2. Then you get this Hessian. Yeah. So once you get that Hessian, this you would have been familiar with our eigenvalue kind of days should remind this particular term. So you take lambda I minus h, you get this, you express this in this form so that you can form a characteristic polynomial and solve it. So once you actually do this, lambda I minus h at x1, this actually this particular determinant actually simplifies into this. X1 is when you actually substitute this point here, you get this term, and then you can form this characteristic polynomial. So you'll get lambda square is equal to 0. Lambda square minus, let's say, 20 is equal to 0. So lambda is equal to plus or minus root 20. So plus
Sorry,
root
what
20
is this lambda I minus h? What is this doing? Lambda I minus h?
Right. So this is h, and lambda I is like I is your 1001, which is a identity matrix.
Correct.
So if you actually multiply lambda, it becomes lambda 0 and 0 lambda, because you're just multiplying it with a scalar. So you got so now lambda 0 0 lambda minus Hessian. So that becomes lambda minus 4x1, 0 minus minus 2, which is 2, and then 0 minus minus 2 again, which is 2. and
So why
lambda
are we doing
minus.
this? Why we are doing lambda minus h?
So I'm trying to see why these things are true. You see this these axioms that I've written at the top. I've not reached there yet. But what I'm trying to explain is when you actually finish doing all these things, you get a lambda, and this is kind of the eigenvalue. So if the eigenvalue of the Hessian matrix is actually a positive, as well as in this case there are two eigenvalues. So there is some eigenvalues. There's one eigenvalue which is root of minus 20. There is another eigenvalue which is root of 20. So one is positive and other one is negative. So this is again according to this lemma, if some eigenvalues are positive and some are negative, or if some are zero, the function is neither strictly concave nor strictly convex, which means at this point, which is at x1, this particular function is neither concave nor convex. So that's how all these things are related. I'm doing the Jacobian, I'm doing the Hessian, I'm trying to calculate the eigenvalue of my Hessian matrix. I'm looking at the eigenvalues, the nature of those eigenvalues. If they are positive, with some positive, some negative, some non-positive, for example, then this is at this point, it's neither convex nor concave. Similarly, if I take another point, let's say another stationary point, 3 by 2 and minus 1 by 4, I do a similar substitution here. I get this lambda 1 and lambda 2. Both of them here are positive points. So according to this lemma here, if all eigenvalues of the Hessian are positive, the function is strictly convex. So strictly convex is what we saw in the first slide. So this is when you say less than or equal to this whole thing is convex. When you just take out this equal to, when it's strictly less than this thing, then then it's called as strictly convex. So I just went through a procedure to show that in the same function, there could be different, depending on which point you are evaluating, you can have a convex region and you can have a non-convex region, or you can have convex region or concave region, or you can have regions that are neither concave nor convex. So that's the whole point. So I'm trying to kind of motivate so that we intuitively understand what a function is, how to calculate this gradient, and what are the different. So these are the things that we actually take for granted because these are kind of the lemmas. But how do we arrive at those lemmas is what I'm just demonstrating as a procedure here. Very simple textbook stuff. Okay. So again, the other very important thing that we'll have to learn is a Taylor series. So any function can be approximated using a Taylor series. Now, what is a Taylor series and what is an expansion of a Taylor series is what you see in this particular slide. So you take any function f of x that
Yeah,
can be
actually,
given.
excuse me. Yeah, there
Yeah.
was a question which we missed on the previous slide. So what if eigenvalues are complex values?
So that means let me go back to that. So when your x1 and x2 here are actually greater than or equal to 0, you will actually not have that condition. So when you have a positive definite or positive semi-definite matrix like this Hessian, you will not have a eigenvalue that is positive or that is negative, that is complex. That is something that's a different kind of a lemma again, which basically means to say intuitively, your whole function is in your positive quadrant. That is what it actually means. When your whole function is when your whole domain and your function evaluation, which is y is equal to f of x, both of them are in the positive quadrant, that's when your whole matrix will evaluate as a positive definite or positive semi-definite. So you'll never have that condition. But if you have that condition, which means that you are in the negative quadrant, we are not actually dealing with that family of problems here. Actually, it will be a little more clear when we get into one example in either linear programming or MILP.
Actually, Sai, our community is not used to this level of mathematics. So it will be great if you can explain more from first principles here. assuming that the community is very new to these kind of concepts. I mean, that is my assumption, at least for me. I'm feeling, but I don't know how audience feels. But it's great stuff. But yes, I think we have to go more first principles approach to
So,
explain us. But that's
so
okay. You go as per what you have planned. But this is my request, if possible.
sure. So the short answer for that is when x1 and x2 are both of them are greater than or equal to 0, you will not have generally not have the complex eigenvalue issue. Whenever your matrix is positive semi-definite, you will not have that complex eigenvalue issue. The other very important thing that you need to understand for any functional approximation is, if you take a function f of x, you can always approximate it using the functional evaluation using actually a bunch of terms. Those bunch of terms are assembled in such a way that any function that you want to evaluate at a point A, that evaluation plus the gradient at that point times the difference between the functional value minus the evaluation at that point, and your Hessian at that point divided by 2 factorial. This is again a scaled term into x minus a the whole square, and so on. You can actually approximate a function using any number of terms. You can just approximate a function using the evaluation, but if you also take the gradient information, you know how the function is sloping, whether it is sloping upward, downward, and all. Whether the function is curving is something that you will get from this third term, and so on. So any higher order curvings and all you'll get from the additional terms. So any function can be approximated using Taylor series expansion. It's very simple concept. Again, there's nothing in detail to go here. The other things are just explanations of the whole thing. There's the Maclaurin series is a specific case of it, and we don't need to be bothered about that at this point of time. So any function can be approximated using a Taylor series using a bunch of terms. The more terms that you actually go, the better approximation you will get. That's the idea that we need to get here. Okay, so we did all these things just as a brush up for some basic math, because later on, if we have gradient, convexity, those kind of stuff, we'll actually jump back to these slides and refresh. Okay, so what is linear programming? Let's say we have a very simple problem here. A farmer is actually trying to actually cultivate wheat and barley. These are the two things that he is trying to cultivate. He has got a bunch of land, let's say L. I think I'm trying to mark something here, L. Maybe we try to use the marker. Yeah. So this is the L. This is the land that the farmer's got. So he is trying to cultivate wheat and barley. So he can. So how much to cultivate? How much of wheat should he cultivate, and how much of barley should he cultivate is something that he can decide. But he has only L amount of land at his disposal. So one of the constraints that he has is x1 plus x2 is less than or equal to L. But why is he cultivating this on the first place? He wants to get some returns on it, the returns on the produce. He gets a bunch of wheat here, x1, a bunch of barley here, x2, which he cultivates, and the returns that he gets for barley is s2 here, and then the returns that he gets for wheat is s1 here. He wants to maximize his returns. He can cultivate x1 and x2. He can, suppose he has 100 square meter of land, he can put 75 for wheat and 25 for barley, or vice versa, or whatever combination. So you got x1 plus x2 is less than or equal to L. That is one of his capacity constraints. But while cultivating, he also needs to do some fertilizer. He wants to apply fertilizer. For wheat, again, there's differential amount he has to apply. Again, for barley, he has to apply a differential amount. But again, there's a limit on fertilizer. He does not have, there's no infinite capacity. Similarly, there is a pesticide application, P1 times X1, P2 times X2 on wheat and barley. So we can actually formulate the whole farmer's problem. What does the farmer want to do? The farmer wants to actually maximize the revenue, maximize his ROI. S1 is the thing that he gets per produce of wheat. S2 is what he gets per produce of barley. So this additive term is what he wants to maximize, subject to these constraints that he has. Now this x1 and x2 should be greater than or equal to 0. So he can either do nothing, which means he's not cultivating anything. X1 and x2 are 0 in that case, or which means that the solution is trivial. He does not even get any other. Here also x1, x2 is 0, so his ROI is 0. But the moment you put in some cultivate, you cannot cultivate negative land. I mean, so that's not possible. So this is where I go back to that positive definite and positive semi-definite thing. For the restricted family of problems which have a positive semi-definite or positive definite stuff in nature, this will always be positive. X1, x2 will always be in the positive quadrant. This way I said we'll wait till linear programming. I hope that clears that point. He cannot cultivate a negative land. The land, either he doesn't cultivate, he cultivates 0, or he cultivates positively some square centimeter for wheat and some other square centimeter for barley. So once he does that, this is his whole setup. Now, what is the optimal stuff that he eventually wants to cultivate x1, x2? He can just put it, once he has formulated this as a linear program, which you see on the screen, he can actually put it in this form again. This is the same form represented in matrix format here. And he can actually convert this less than equal to terms into a little bit of augmented constraints, which means that you can add a slack variable and make them equality constraints. An inequality constraint can be made into equality constraint by assuming a slack variable. So he actually converts that into that form. And now he's got, because he's got 2 more variables, he's got a 5 variable problem, x1, x2, x3, and x4 and x5. So he got 5 variable problems here, and he's got one objective equation here. So here's the objective equation, S1, S2. And if he crunches this into the system, he'll actually get the values of x1, x2, x3, x4, and x5. So that's a very simple way in which he can find out what is the optimal x1 and x2 that he needs to calculate for wheat and barley. Why is this is called linear programming? Because all the constraints we've got here are linear in nature. There is no nonlinear term. And even the objective function is linear in nature. There's no nonlinear term. That's why this is called linear programming. So a bunch of things like network flow optimization, just to make sure the capacity scheduling in the network is done properly. That is a linear program. If you have if you have a mixture problem, like you've got 3 variants, and you want to know how many variants of what variety you need to produce to optimize your product, optimize your eventual profit, that is again can be posed as a linear programming problem, which is actually the same here. I mean, you can think of his variants as the wheat and barley, and he can actually maximize this linear combination. So this is a very simple idea of linear programming. But this also, it's weird, I'm not able to move my, probably to go to pointer, that's why. Yeah. Okay, so the other thing, the other way we can also think about
erase. There's an erase all option. If you are using GoToWebinar digital pen, there's an erase all option. Yeah.
That. Sure. So, so last time we just saw a very simple linear program, but I mean, there it was all continuous variables. I can actually say that I want 25.7 square meters of land for wheat and 74.63 square meters of land for something else. So I can say that. But let's say there's another problem. The company produces 2 products. One is some chandeliers and the other one is ceiling fan. Let's say again chandelier is X1, ceiling fan is X2. My per unit chandelier, I get $7 profit. I get $6 profit for a ceiling fan. But both, in order to produce both of them, I need some wiring hours, I need some assembly hours. So but the total wiring hours that I have in my hand is 12, out of which, I mean, if I choose to do a chandelier, at least 2 hours is going for one chandelier. 2 hours into number of chandeliers that I want to make, plus three times the number of ceiling fans that I'm trying to make. That will be my capacity constraint, which is 12 wiring hours. Similarly, chandelier assembly takes me 6 units. Ceiling fan assembly takes me 5 units. And depending on how much I want to do, I'm rate limited by my capacity, which is 30. So similar problem like wheat and barley. Here we have got chandelier and fans. But here the problem is I cannot say a real variable here. I cannot say I created 2.7 fans or 5.6 chandeliers. So this has to be the number of chandeliers or ceiling fans produced should be an integer. So once you apply x1, x2 is greater than or equal to 0, and x1 comma x2 is an element of integer. I didn't put that thing here. Then this whole thing becomes an integer program. So it will have a very similar structure, let's say as a linear program, but with an additional constraint that your x1, x2, which are the design variables that you want to optimize, they are now going to be integers. They're going to be integers. They can be actually whole numbers also, because you can have 0 as a solution also. Yeah. So that is the difference between integer program and a general linear program. But the key thing to note here is, if you want to actually solve this as a linear program, if you relax that integer constraints, if I just for a moment take out that x1, x2 need not be constrained as an integer, if I just do this right here, I might get a solution like this: 3, 4, 2, 1, in which in this equation it is 9. It's kind of understandable because it's trying to put less weight on x4 equal to 1, less weight on x4 because of negative term. It wants to reduce this negative term, and it wants to maximize all these three. It's given more 3, 4, 2. Then your z is equal to 9. It actually satisfies all these constraints. But this is quite different from this. The solution is when I actually treat it as an integer programming problem. But this is quite different from if I take out that integer constraint, all variables are integers. If I take out this constraint, then it gives a completely different solution. Though the objective function is almost the same, now my design variables are completely different. So that is something which is very important to note. There are a lot of methods for solving this integer linear programming kind of problems. We're not going to get into any of these methods, but I just want to just put them for the sake of completion. Most importantly, branch and bound methods and cutting plane, Gomori's cutting plane methods are mostly used in many software packages. In some future sessions, we'll just get to know how these methods work in detail.
Yeah, there is
Okay.
a question here. Can't we take floor of output from linear programming to get integer output?
Correct. That's exactly what was done. That was the kind of thing that I tried to show here. If you take the floor of output, x4 will be like, let's say 0 here, and this also will be 0. Most of these things will be 0, and still you'll get some kind of a objective which is very similar, but then you'll only end up making 1. So what I'm saying is the kind of solutions will be very different, and actually it's not a good idea to do that. Why? Because actually I'll come to that in a later slide. Yeah, it's actually not a good idea to do that, because these are completely different formulations. When you don't put this all variables or integer constraint, then you are completely relaxing this integer program into a very free flow linear program, which is exactly not what we want. Okay, so one thing that I want to actually do here, the math is going to be a little complex, but we don't need to understand everything here. But the intuition behind the Lagrange multiplier is something that we want to understand in this slide. I'll go step by step here. Again, you don't need to understand everything, but you need to understand the problem structure so that later on we'll use this structure. What is the difference between what we spoke so far in linear program and integer program and this formulation? It is this. So minimize a certain function f of x. Now this function can be, let's say, a nonlinear function. This need not be a simple weighted average kind of thing that we last time C1, Ci, Xi kind of model need not be followed here. Now your objective can be nonlinear and your constraints also can be nonlinear. Some gi of x, the first constraint, minus bi is greater than or equal to 0. These bunch of constraints are called inequality constraints, and there can also be some equality constraints. It can be a mix of them. Any problem of this structure is actually called nonlinear program, and you need nonlinear optimization techniques for solving these family of problems. Okay, so before we get into how this thing is solved, generally what happens is now this kind of formulation is a bunch of nonlinear constraints with a nonlinear objective. Now we want to actually convert this into a series of solvable equations. For that, we do something called as a Lagrangian, augmented Lagrangian. Okay, and this is where the next 2 minutes I'll just explain it. It's okay if you don't understand. In the next slide, I have a geometric intuition behind it. At that time, we'll understand it better. So what this augmented Lagrangian means is this particular it has 4 different conditions. One is, first of all, there is something called Lagrangian multiplier that should be positive. It should have positive Lagrangian multipliers. And for every constraint equation that we see in our model formulation, we actually have a corresponding term in the Lagrangian space. The derivative of this constraint equation with one Lagrangian. So lambda 1 g1 of x1 here plus lambda 2 g2 of x2 here. So those two terms are needed if we have two different constraints here. So you're expressing your constrained optimization setup here into an unconstrained optimization setup for us to actually do some perturbations. For that, how we do? First, we actually take the derivative of the function and take the summation of the Lagrangian of the gradients of the constraints, and then you just add them up, and then you take the negative of it and just add it to the derivative function. I'll just explain why we do this in the next slide. That's what this term basically says. This is called an augmented Lagrangian. And we have a complementary slackness, which basically means to say at any given point of time, when my objective function and my constraint are touching each other, my Lagrangian one of these constraints is going to be 0, which means that the Lagrangian multiplier associated with that constraint will be a positive value. And if it is not 0, that will actually be, this Lagrangian multiplier will be 0. This is what is called complementary slackness, which actually can be inferred from this term, which basically says either lambda I is 0 for this whole term to be 0, or this whole term has to be 0 for this whole term to be 0. This is what is called a complementary slackness. Now let's go to intuitively. Okay, before that, let's just go through this procedure of solving a problem, and then I'll get into the geometric intuition behind what this is. Or maybe I'll do the other way. Okay, so let's first get into the intuition. So let's say we have got an objective function which is highly nonlinear. Okay, so this objective function evaluates into some value d1 for a given set of x and y's, and some value d2, d3, and so on. So whenever you see this this circle like this, this objective function is very complex. So whenever you see a circle like this with a certain f of xy equal to d1, all the points around here will have this value d1, and all the points around here will have this value d2. These are the objective function contours. Similarly, you've got your one of the contours of one constraint. So what basically happens is when you are doing this nonlinear optimization in the geometric space, you are actually taking this constraint. This constraint will be somewhere here initially. You are trying to move this constraint towards an optimal value. So depending on whether it's minimization or maximization, you will try to move it along so that you reach this d1. For example, if it's minimization, if it's maximization, you'll move this constraint somewhere around here. But when you actually touch this particular point, what really happens is this point here is actually your R. This constraint here is actually your B here. And this objective function, let's say that is your R. So at this point, the rate at which this objective function changes and the rate at which this constraint changes. For a unit change in my constraint, if I just move it a little bit here or a little bit that side, the change in the objective function contour that I am going to realize, that is actually my Lagrangian multiplier. That is the intuitive meaning geometrically of the Lagrangian multiplier. Now, if I go back and check that term, either it is 0. When this is binding, the Lagrangian multiplier has to be 0. When it is non-binding, when it's a little outside, the Lagrangian multiplier, when this is binding, the Lagrangian multiplier will be some multiple of this, which will be positive. But this term itself will be 0 because these two are touching each other. At this point, both the objective function value and this value is going to be, if I take a tangent, this is going to be 0. So the complementary slackness comes because of this. Why do we need to know a little bit about this Lagrangian? Because all our nonlinear optimization problems actually are converted into one unconstrained optimization problem as a system of linear equations. For example, we have got one function like this, and we've got two constraints like this. Let's say both are equality constraints. I've got a function which is nonlinear in nature. You've got g of x1, so gi of xi minus bi. There are two constraints here in this case. Now you can actually take the so this you can actually take the 6 inside. This is the standard form of just making this notation. Now here again, you take the gradient of the function 4x1, 2x2, 8x3. That is the gradient of this function. I'm just writing it in the matrix form. And you take the lambda 1 here. Lambda 1 is actually this, you want to actually differentiate this function. So this is 1, 2, and minus 1. That is your differential values for x1, x2, and x3. And similarly, x1, x2, and x3 for lambda 2 are these values. Now again, because you've got minus 6 and minus 12, you can actually use this formulation itself. This equation G1, this equation G2 is what you see in the first two. And you also take these three equations, 4, 2, 8 for x1, x2, x3. You put it in the diagonal, and you got a lambda here, 1, 2, minus 1. This is lambda 1, this is lambda 2. And you can actually get your lambda 1, x1, x2, x3, lambda 1, and lambda 2 based on these 5 equations. So that's how you actually get the solution. Any problem in visualizing the setup here? I can explain this again. All I'm doing is putting all the x1 coefficients here, x2 coefficients here, x3 coefficients here, lambda 1 coefficients here, lambda 2 coefficients here. So your x1 is actually in this G1, for example, you got an x1, you got an x2, you got an x3. That is why you got 3 values. You don't have lambda 1 and lambda 2, so you got zeros here. In these 3 equations, you got lambda 1s and lambda 2s, but you don't have
Sai,
either.
can you quickly brief through this slide again? There was a question or request also on that.
In this slide, right?
Yes.
Okay, so basically I've got a objective function which is nonlinear in nature. So this is a nonlinear programming. It is no longer linear, and I've got a bunch of 2 constraints here. And now I express my delta f, which is basically, I go back to this. I'm trying to express it this way: the gradient of my objective function minus, in this case, lambda 1 g1 plus lambda 2 g2. Okay. This is lambda 1 g1, which is x1, x2, x3's thing, and lambda 2 g2. I've expressed this at the optimal point. This is what my condition is. So I just expressed the same condition for this. So I've got lambda 1 g1. So this I've differentiated with respect to x1, x2, and x3. So lambda 1 times that differential plus lambda 2 times the delta of g2 x2, which is g2 given x1 is 2, g2 of x2 is minus 2, and this is 3. I'm just differentiating G2 with respect to X1, I get 2. Differentiating G2 with respect to X2 minus 2. Similarly, I get 3. That's how I get this. This has to be satisfied at my optimal point. Similarly, at my optimal point, this also has to be satisfied. This is my constraint. This has to be satisfied according to the problem. So I get 1, 2 minus 1. It has to be 6. 2, 2 minus 2, 3. It has to be 12. And these three, like 4 minus 1 and minus 2. That is this equation, first equation. 2 minus 2 and plus 2. 2 minus 2 and plus 2. That is this equation. And 8, 1 and 8 minus 8, 1 and minus 3. That is your this equation. That's how I'm setting it up. Because I'm setting it up in matrix form, I think you might not get it immediately, but believe me, if you just write it down in paper and do everything, we'll get the same thing. So once you get this, you can solve for x1, x2, x3, lambda 1, lambda 2. You've got 5 equations, 5 unknowns. At the binding point, these multiplies will be 0, and you get x, which is this. So if you substitute these x's, you should be able to get the optimal objective function here. That is how this whole nonlinear programming is solved. So any complex thing. Yeah.
There are two questions: how to solve if we have inequality constraints.
Correct. So this is regarding equality constraint. If you have got inequality constraint, first thing you have to do is you have to convert that equality into inequality by actually using a complementary variable. You can include a slack variable, like how we did in how we did here. See, initially we had only x1, x2 is lesser than or equal to L, but I just introduced this x3 here, this place, which is a slack variable. If you add that term, then that could be equal to L. So similarly, I introduce x4 and x5. So similarly, for every inequality constraint, we'll have to introduce that slack variable. Now this space will become a little bigger, and then this matrix will become a bigger, but the procedure will be the same.
Okay, next question is, can you please explain how does first matrix come in first equation?
This one, first matrix in the first equation. I'm just trying to figure out whether this is being asked.
That 4x1 is a derivative, so it's a derivative of f. If you take
Correct.
a derivative of f, you get 4x1 and 2x2 and 8x3. So I think first one is just a derivative of x, right?
Correct, that's right. And why does it come in the first place? Because of this. At the optimal point,
right,
no direction which improves objective and is feasible is possible, which means that the gradient of fx star minus lambda 1 g1 minus lambda 2 g2. That's the reason it comes. Minus lambda 1 into g1. G1 is again the derivative of this with respect to all 3 dimensions. G2 is derivative of this with respect to all 3 dimensions. That's how.
How was G1 and G2 got computed?
These are given. This is my problem.
So this is given problem statement. Okay.
Yeah, this is a problem statement. So I want to actually maximize this objective given these two constraints.
This is pseudo inverse, right?
Yeah, it's a pseudo inverse. Okay, so right now what we saw was, now I just want to motivate a little bit before we get into evolutionary side, why we are getting into evolutionary side. Now we saw that for simple toy problems like this, x1, x2, x3, just 3 dimensions, we're getting into a big, so all the Hessians need, all the derivatives need to be calculated. Sometimes Hessians need to be calculated. A lot of times it's highly difficult to, when you're looking at millions of parameters, it's highly difficult to get a very good stable solution. Now, what if instead of going from one point to the other, if you just take a whole bunch of points and try to deal with an optimization framework which actually handles it that way? So that's the motivation behind evolutionary optimization. So let's say, let's again take a very simple example. Let's say we have an electric car, and our goal in making this and we are expected to design this electric car in such a way that the range of the electric car should be very high. Like if I actually fill some fuel, I should get a long range. I should be able to drive a lot of miles or kilometers based on that fuel, which basically also means that my mileage should be very high. I want a maximal range, but at the same time, if I want to get maximal range in an electric car, I'll actually put in a lot of stuff in my battery. I'll add more and more battery cells, which means my weight is going to be more. For a given power, the way that weight has to be pulled, which means that my acceleration, my pickup will be a little lagging. So I want a minimal acceleration time, but also a maximal range. So this is so while I'm going to talk about evolutionary optimization, while dealing with problems of this kind, this is also called a multi-objective optimization, because one of my objectives is maximizing my range. The other is, for example, minimizing my acceleration time. I've got two objectives. Sometimes these objectives are competing with each other. You cannot for a given bunch of design variables, you cannot have one thing and also have the other thing simultaneously. There's always a trade-off in many of the cases. Let's say there is a range here in x-axis in kilometers, and y is acceleration in terms of seconds. In order to go 0 to 100 kilometer per hour, how many seconds do I take? That is my x-axis, and range is my y-axis. I can have some design variables, the amount of battery cells that I can pack, the rating of the motor, for example, or some kind of a drivetrain variable which is related to tires or something like that. So I can have a bunch of design variables, but whatever variables I tweak, let's say I put in more cells here, I might get a better range, but at the same time, because I'm putting in more mass, I will be actually also compromising a little bit on the acceleration. So ideally, I would like to have a very low acceleration with a very high range. Ideally, my point should be somewhere here, 800 within a second. I go to 800. I mean, within a second, I should be able to accelerate 0 to 100 kilometer per hour. But in that design, I should also get a range of 800. But that's not possible because I mean, physical systems are restrictive and the design variables are actually conflicting and competing with each other. Now, what typically happens is we typically get points like this. We can get a lot of very quick acceleration by compromising the range, or we can compromise the acceleration and we can get a higher range. So we've got a bunch of candidate solutions that we can generate. Now, there are some points here, if you can see this, and I'll come back to this Pareto frontier concept later. But intuitively, again, if I take one point here, this point cannot be dominated so easily by any point. So if some point has to dominate this, so this point basically says that given I am accelerating at 2.5 seconds for the 0 to 100 kilometer per hour, the maximum range that is possible is only 600. If I can get more range, but then I will be actually compromising more. I have to go 2.6, 2.7 and all. So a bunch of such points that dominates are actually found on this frontier. That is what we call as a Pareto frontier. And we'll formally define it when we come to multi-objective optimization. But we need to know this a little bit because these points are highly desired points, because each of these points have a unique story for them. At this point, for a given acceleration, this is the best range that I can get. Or I mean, I can go this way, reduce a little bit of acceleration, but I'll have to compromise on the range. But I want a better range, I need to compromise on the acceleration. So this frontier points are like this. And remember, I'm showing this on 2 dimensions just for intuition and simplicity. I can have hundreds of multiple objectives. I can have my design variable space, which is again million dimensional or whatever it is. So we cannot visualize anything of that. So we need methods in which we can efficiently derive this Pareto frontier. And that's what the whole family of multi-objective optimization does. And most of our real world problems are multi-objective optimization problems. Let me go into a little bit on how this happens. I'll again give an intuition. I'll not go too much into the, I'll go a little bit into the math, but I'll give you an intuition side by side so that you can later go and read on the paper for complete rigor on this. So what basically one of the algorithms does is it first samples a bunch of points which are very good on either dimensions. Let's say the acceleration side here or the range side here. Let's say this frontier here, D, E, and all these green points. I'll actually evaluate some points in which I will draw one frontier, and then slowly there will be some points which will be dominated by this frontier, which will be very close to that. I will also sample some of those points and I'll put a blue, and they will dominate some other points here. Now, the concept of dominance here is, and I'll again come back to this, but just to give a brief overview, concept of dominance is this point is the best point for my, let's say both these objectives are minimization objectives. I'll have to minimize F2 and minimize F1 also. Now, this has to be as low as possible, but if I come lower than this, I need to go right side. I need to compromise a little bit on my F1. There's no way I can not go to my left and still come down. That is what this point basically tells me. This frontier basically tells me. This is a good frontier for me to actually, ideally my good solution should be around this Pareto frontier. For that, I actually sample a lot of frontiers. I actually sample a lot of points and see that which points they do dominate. And I also sample them. I form another front and I keep drawing different fronts. And this is like, this is what so these points are non-dominated. These blue points are non-dominated by these red points. Again, these red points are non-dominated by the further colored points, which is not shown in this figure. So you want a bunch of non-dominated points because they are your Pareto optimal points. Now, is it good enough if you just have non-dominated points? Because it may so happen that you can actually sample only in this space. You may not sample in this whole space. So you'll actually lose the whole diversity. So you have to also, while you have to sample this frontier effectively, you'll also have to do a diverse sampling at this frontier, for which there is something called crowding distance sorting. The crowded tournament selection is what they call in literature. What it basically means is there's a point I, there's also a point I minus 1, I plus 1 in your given frontier, and you can actually take a simple distance function, distance metric, which basically says this whole metric basically says that the farther this point is from a clustered set of points, the more this point is preferred. In other words, I want actually, if there's a crowded region, it's okay if I sample 1 or 2 points in this region, and I want to go as fast as possible to the non-crowded region so that I sample this whole efficient frontier. That is what this crowded tournament selection means. Here, just for an example, I've got some labels here, A, B, C, D, E. If I take individual C here, the blue point, this one dominates B, which means that it is better in terms of objective F2, it is lesser than B. It is better in terms of objective F1 also, it is lesser than B. So this completely dominates B. But it does not dominate A, because A is actually better both in terms of A is better in terms of F1 than C, so it does not dominate. So that's not dominate. So C completely dominates B. Let's say D. D completely dominates everything, A, B, and C. It is better, it is lower in F2 than ABC. It is lower in F1 than ABC. And you can actually keep making this table for individuals E and a lot of these points. And then you can go back to which are the ones that are oft repeating. You go to that and you see which point that particular value dominates. So this, you can keep doing this non-dominated sorting. This is what they call as non-dominated sorting, along with this crowded tournament selection. You actually, and you make sure you sample in a diverse frontier. If you actually combine these two, this is what is called non-dominated sorting genetic algorithm with crowded tournament selection. How do you do the
Okay,
tournament selection? Typically, yeah.
there are some questions. Can we compare Pareto frontier to bias variance trade-off concept? Number one. And number two, domination concept is not clear.
Okay. So the first is, can we compare this to bias variance trade-off? Okay. It is a trade-off. It is not exactly a bias variance trade-off. Let me just. So, so typically in a bias variance trade-off, what happens is when you basically introduce some bias in order to reduce your variance, and if you're completely unbiased, your variance may be huge. That's so those two statements are kind of very they go hand in hand. But here it is more like you cannot. It's not it's not possible at all in the first place to actually sample a point which does equally good on both the dimensions beyond a certain level. Let's say this point, it's giving a range of 600 at 2.5. If I want to go below 2.5, I will have to compromise on the range. There's no other way. That is the trade-off which is kind of mentioned when I mentioned as trade-off. And similarly, when I want to go higher in range, it is just not possible to go higher in range at this 2.5. I'll have to trade off a little bit of acceleration. That is what this means. Now coming back to the second question, that's the trade-off that I meant. It's not the bias variance trade-off. Now trade-off in terms of these parameters. Okay, now the second question is the domination concept is not clear. Okay, so when this particular setup exists, when I cannot go higher in one objective without compromising another objective, it means that this point is kind of dominating all my other points. Like this point, let me actually go back to this to explain this. Let's say a point C. Why would I actually take this? Okay, let's take point B here. B has a certain value for F2 and a certain value for F1. Here our objective is F2 has to be minimized, F1 also has to be minimized. So our ideal point is somewhere here near the 0, 0, but that's not physically possible. Let's say I take a point B. Why would I take a point B when I have a point C, which actually both is better in terms of F2 and also in terms of F1. So C is better than B both in terms of F2 and F1. This means that C completely dominates B, and this completely dominates B. It is complete domination. So I don't even care about B for my real solution now. So now I'm more interested in this point C. This is what the concept of dominance is. Now I don't need to completely dominate, even if I'm equal in B in all other aspects, but dominate in just one particular aspect, that is still dominance because I'm not worse than B in any aspect in that sense. So I think those 2 points should help clarify what is dominance. Okay, so again, for any multi-objective optimization in the evolutionary sense, what we do is we actually take a population. We actually simulate a population. A population will have two parents. Two parents will come together. Let's say this gene, what you see here, gene 1, gene 2, gene 3. You can roughly think about them as like there is one P1, gene 2, gene 1 is related to, in the previous example, let's say battery parameters. Gene 2, let's say it's related to the tire parameters. Gene 3 is related to the motor parameters and all that. So you can actually take a particular point, which is an assemblage of all these parameters, which basically means that you are representing one of these points as a parent here, and you're representing another point you just cross over between these two. So I don't want to, I think in one of the AGI sessions, we covered all this crossover and mutation and stuff. So you do crossovers and mutations for a given parent, crossover between parents, and mutation on a given genotype, and then you actually see what is the new generation that is getting created. That is what the whole concept of the evolutionary algorithm is. But then here, the rank dominance and crowding dominance. For example, if I have a point, let's say, if I have a parent with a rank A1 and a crowding B1, and another parent with rank A2 and crowding B2. So what do I mean by rank here? Let me just go back to this. If I am in this frontier, this green frontier, I am in rank 1. That is my most desired point. Let's say this is rank 2, the blue one, the next most desired point. Then there is a rank 3, the next most desired point. So it goes in that order. So if I am rank dominating someone, I would prefer that point. If both are in the same space, let's say both the points are in this space, I go for a point which is kind of alone, because I want to sample the whole frontier here. That is what this second crowding piece means. So that's the intuition behind rank dominance and crowding based dominance. So I actually select those parents which are highly rank dominant, which are in a less crowded region, so that I get the whole Pareto, and I assemble such parents. I actually kind of cross them, and I do some mutations around them, and I keep repeating them generation after generation. I'll eventually get a very good solution for my genetic algorithm. So that's a little piece on the intuition behind what is a Pareto friend, what is Pareto optimality, what is dominance, how do I actually generate a population, do crossover mutation, how do I arrive at values. So that's how that happens. Typically these are used in a lot of multi-objective optimization formulations, because what happens in a multi-objective space is, if you have millions of variables, some of them continuous and some of them discrete, the space is not very continuous, the space can be irregular, and the space can be very high dimensional. For that, you need to sample these kind of evolutionary methods. They don't depend on gradient based methods, gradient based convergence properties. They converge if you keep doing and doing, as long as you sample very smartly those dominating points, do a good crossover and improve your fitness function generation over generation, they will actually give a good solution. NSGA2 especially performs very well in the field for a variety of problems. Now, again, multi-objective, this is the formal multi-objective optimization structure. Just like we gave the structure for nonlinear program, integer program, and mixed integer linear program, here is the general structure for multi-objective optimization. You can have multiple objectives, multiple constraints, equalities and inequalities, and multiple bounded constraints. And you want to find the Pareto optimal front. Yeah, this we already saw the dominance here. This again dominance explained in a different way. I'll just skip this. I'll actually skip this slide because this is actually a bunch of traditional methods which solve for this Pareto optimal front. But since we already saw NSGA2, okay, just for information, I'll tell about these methods. There is a weighted multiplier method. Basically, what you do is, since you have multiple objectives, you give some weight. You're saying my objective 1 is weights between 0 to 1, 0.5, two objectives, 0.5 of F1, 0.5 of F2, which means that you are equally weighing both of them, or you can say 0.9 of F1, 0.1 of F2. You can also express it that way. And this just gets converted into a very regular nonlinear optimization or a linear optimization problem, depending on the structure. We can do that, or we can actually optimize for one objective, making other objectives as constraints, put some threshold on the other objectives. There are several different ways in which you can actually do this, but these are very traditional methods. As I said, all these methods have a lot of drawbacks. That's why I first explained the NSGA method, which at least will take you kind of near optimal solution, though the global optimum is not guaranteed. But under some very good restrictions, the elitist NSGA does guarantee some global convergence. But these are some methods that we can skip. Yeah, so as I said, again in this, I just listed down a bunch of elitist and non-elitist evolutionary algorithms for multi-objective optimization. What do I mean by elitist? When you actually, in a certain generation, you take top n parents which have done very well and just move them to the next generation also. You don't just cross over them and lose them. Cross over them, you might get some other generation which is better, but the elitist thing actually retains the previous generation's toppers also. That is what is elitist. Again, a bunch of methods. This is a big area in itself, so we don't need to get too much into this. But what we saw is we used an explicit diversity preserving strategy with an elite preservation strategy. We want to actually preserve that rank. That's why we used rank dominant solutions. We also wanted a crowded distance behavior. That is our diversity preserving strategy. So NSGA2 applies both of these things. So I've done both NSGA2 and another comparable method here. Before I show this, I'll just show this in the code, how this really looks like. Just get into. I'm just seeing where is my code. Yeah, it's here. So here again, there is a, typically this is again not a code walkthrough, but there is a package called PyMOO, Python Multi-Objective Optimization. It was a package which was released in 2020 by Professor Deb's lab in Michigan State, Kalyanmoy Deb. He was the NSGA2 pioneer. So you can actually clone. I just cloned his GitHub, and you can actually import the problem. You can set up the whole problem. You can just say how many variables, how many objectives you have, how many number of constraints you have, and what is the lower bound, upper bound of the variables. You can define everything here, and you can also give x all row 0 is your x1 variable. You can also give the functional form. You can also give the gradient form. This is the functional evaluation. This is the gradient evaluation, and this is the Pareto optimal front evaluation. And finally, you just call the algorithm. So the coding here is very simple. So you just call the algorithm. You can do some crossover and mutation strategies with some probabilities and some eta. It has some kind of a learning rate or a mixture rate. When you do this, generation after generation, you will actually have values. It will just get better and better, and finally, in the last thing, you will kind of hit the convergence. And if you look at what is your functional convergence at the end, this is your Pareto optimal front that you got for this problem, and these are the different points, and these are the different function evaluations. And if you want to get to the points, you can actually go to this resultant object and say whether you want to go for this point or this point. You can just query that point there. This is generally how it works. There's this concept of hypervolume and all. I don't want to get in there at this point. That is a code demo. But because it's very simple, the whole problem is how do you set up that problem intuitively. Once you set up, you can just convert that into PyMOO and you can solve it. Okay, so I'm coming to the last part of this this lecture, and this is going to be the kind of the most complicated part. Before that, I'll take some questions. Are there any questions here?
Yeah, there was a question on a much previous slide. When do you say some point is better than the other? I think that was on the Pareto boundary. When you say some point is better than the other.
Yeah, in so in multi-objective parlance, we generally don't say a point is better than the other, we just say a point dominates the other. We say better than the other depending on which dimension we are talking about. A point dominates the other. I'll go back to that slide actually. It's actually, yeah. So x1 dominates x2 if solution x1 is not worse than x2 in all objectives, which means that it should be at least as good as x2 in all objectives. And it should be strictly better than x2 in at least one objective. That is when we call x1 dominates x2. And if it completely dominates it in every objective, then it completely dominates. That's full dominance. But it doesn't need to dominate in every objective. It's okay if it's equal to that in all objectives except one, but in that one, it should be better than this x2. Then x1 dominates x2, which is the vice versa also. x2 is dominated by x1. So here, so I think, okay, here there's an example also I gave, it seems. So f1 of maximize here in the x-axis, f2 of minimize in the y-axis. So we basically want a point which is somewhere to the right. So we want a point like f. But then if you think f1 and 5, f is better, f is equal to 1 in this f2 minimization objective. Okay, but it's definitely better in maximization objective of f1. So f 5 dominates 1. Similarly, 1 dominates 2 because this is definitely 1 is definitely better than 2 in this f1, which is maximization along x-axis. It also dominates f2 in the y-axis because it's minimization. So it clearly dominates 2. 1 dominates 2. And 1 versus 4, for example, this is a good one. So 1 versus 4, neither solution dominates. Now we cannot say 1 dominates 4 because though 1 is better in terms of f2, which is the minimization, f1, which is minimization, 4 is better. And similarly, 4 is better in maximization, but it's not good in minimization. So none of them dominate.
Are these points comparable to support vector points of SVMs?
So in support vector points of SVMs, the idea there is you want to have the most significant points near my maximal margin hyperplane, which are sufficient enough for me to represent the whole data set. That is my support vector. My whole data set on the other side, one class, has these hinged on these support vectors on one side, and on the other side also they're hinged on a bunch of support vectors. So my whole decision space, my whole data space can be just represented by those bunch of points vectors for me to draw my maximal margin hyperplane, which means that the other points actually really don't matter. The connect that I see here is, if I say that the Pareto optimal points are the points that are in the frontier, those are the points that are really concerning to me for my near optimal solutions. All the dominated points inside are really of not much use to me. So there's a kind of a parallel logic, just a parallel logic, similar logic, but still the concept there is a little different. There the whole data is represented by those support vectors very effectively. Here it is not the case. Here the data is not represented. Here the Pareto front actually dominates the whole data, and it just gives me a good guide to optimality here. Okay, I'll go to so I'll go to intuitive example right away in Bayesian stuff, because this is going to be extremely complex. So in order to understand Bayesian optimization, it's actually better to understand a little bit of Gaussian process, which in itself is a little complicated. So let me start intuitively right away so that people don't get lost in the mathematical terms. Let's say we have a certain distribution like this, what you see on the chart. Let's say this is the gold content. This is this is the ground truth for the gold content which is present in a place. We have to drill that place and we'll have to find gold. Now, one of the problems, which is active learning problem, is that if you really want to understand the whole gold distribution, you'll have to sample in multiple points. You'll have to kind of drill multiple locations. Ideally, if your drilling has no cost, you can drill in this whole grid, and you can say, okay, which one is have, you exactly get this. But then the drilling operation is very costly, which means to say that you cannot drill everywhere because your function evaluation is very costly. Now we should drill at some points so that we get some approximate idea of this curve. So in order to get approximate idea of this distribution, how do you empirically find it from some of the sample points that we evaluate? If you're dealing with that problem, that is called as an active learning problem. You're kind of learning the whole structure behind. Now the other problem is we are not interested in getting this whole distribution. What if we got this whole distribution right, but we ended up spending a lot of time in this point where the gold content is very less? I'm only interested in getting to this point right here, this peak right here, where the gold content is very high, so that I can get my gold drilled properly here. Now that problem is actually pretty close to a Bayesian optimization problem. So active learning is to find the kind of the whole distribution of this curve and find that part, sample from that part of the distribution, so that you can maximize the the output. That is what we call as the Bayesian, something which is akin to a Bayesian optimization problem. That is what is explained in problems, the statements here 1 and 2. You can just go through it for a second just to find the difference between these two problems. What happens is initially we can assume some prior. So initially we don't know this. This is a ground truth. So you can assume this prior. This is this black line is my prior, highly non-informative. We're just saying that the gold content could be just something, and depending on wherever I sample, the gold content would be something which I don't know. And the uncertainty is this gray band, which again is kind of a lot because I don't know anything. Once I randomly pick a point and I just drill that point, I get some value here. Let's say I get some value here. Now I know the ground truth of that value because I've drilled and I've got the stuff. I know the ground truth of that value, and then I keep. So based on that, now this curve changes here. Near that value, I know that the gold content is going to be something, but it's not going to drastically change. But it'll change. But as I move away from that point, again my uncertainty increases. I know only about the neighborhood of that point. I can say something with some confidence, but as I go away from that point, I have no confidence in saying anything. Yeah, again, everything is a black box. I don't know anything here. Now, the more and more I sample, the more and more things get a little clearer. But then, are there some intelligent ways in which I can sample? Because I really don't know this function. This is a black box. Remember how we started? We started function which we could see clearly. There's a functional form. We can derive gradients. We can analytically make some gradient-based procedures in all my nonlinear linear programming problems. Then slowly the thing got very high dimensional. There is no regularity. It's very high dimensional. Now I went to evolutionary optimization. Now even in evolutionary optimization, I had some criteria with which I could rank which solution is better than which solution. Now in this case, I don't know my function evaluation. I don't know the function at all. It's kind of a black box to me, but I'm trying to infer that function. I'm just writing a prior on that function, which is just this line with some bounds, and I'm trying to sample 1. Now, as I keep sampling, first I do this, I sample this. There's a huge variance. In the second iteration, because there's a huge variance, I see where is the variance the highest. I go to this point, again I sample. From here again I come back to this point because I see variance is highest here. Let me sample in places where my uncertainty is a lot. That's my logic. I sample here, and I again get this point. Similarly, I get another point here in this vicinity, and I keep doing this, and finally I've kind of got some idea based on how I actually post my uncertainty, how I just explode, and how I little bit exploited in this space and this space. I know where gold is less and gold is more. Now this whole process we are going to deal mathematically right now. So it's better to first get the intuition. This is the intuition. If there's any question in this intuition, I'll just take it up before we get into the math. Because this intuition, if we get, this is the same intuition that is applicable for Bayesian methods. This is the same intuition that is applicable for multi-armed bandits, same intuition for reinforcement learning. Some of these intuitions also apply for active learning. So it's very important to get this intuition right. Okay, so let me just go to this. First let's talk about a little bit about the Gaussian distribution. We know that Gaussian distribution in one dimension is 1 by root 2 pi sigma into e power minus 1 by 2 x minus nu whole power x minus nu transpose into sigma inverse, which is the small sigma, into x minus mu. This one, the bigger sigma, is actually a matrix, and this x here is actually a vector, because this is a multivariate Gaussian distribution. This is not just a one-dimensional Gaussian distribution anymore. This is actually a multivariate Gaussian distribution now. Suppose you are looking at data like this dotted line data. You can actually create a kernel, this covariance matrix, in such a way that this covariance, every point that you sample, let me actually again intuitively explain this. This will be a little difficult. If I actually sample a point here, because this is 2 dimensions, this point will have some covariance structure to it. Let me just go back and see if I can explain it this way. Okay, let me go through this statement. Let's see if this is clear. A Gaussian process is a random process where any point in a d-dimensional space, let's say assume a point in 3 dimensions, sample a point, that is assigned a random variable f of x, where the joint distribution of a finite number of these variables. Now the 3 dimensions have f of x1, f of x2, and f of x3. Okay, so you can actually make a joint likelihood, a joint probability of f of x1, f of x2, and f of x3 is actually that point. Now that joint probability may have a specific covariance structure to it, but that point which is sampled, which is f of x, is actually a Gaussian, which is sampled out of these functions. So actually your Gaussian process is actually a process with a mean of f of x1, f of x2, and so on up to f of xn for n dimension. There is a mean function. The mean itself is a mean of functions. You can sample from any of those functions 1 point, and that realization, all those function points put together, will be a point in this 3-dimensional space. That is actually the intuition behind the mean. And any specific kind of covariance structure, which is k of x comma x1, k of x1 comma x2, x2 comma x3, and all, that will be your covariance matrix. I know this concept is a little difficult to visualize, but how you can think about this is that you can take a point, if it's a point in a 3-dimensional space, for one of the dimensions, let's say point is 1 comma 2 comma 3, you can say that one coordinate 1 comes from this function f of x1, that the second coordinate, which is 2, comes from f of x2, and the third coordinate 3 comes from f of x3. You can just roughly imagine like that, and the joint probability gives you that point x. So a Gaussian process is a process where any point is assigned a random variable f of x, where the joint distribution of a finite number of these variables is itself Gaussian. So this function itself is Gaussian. This f itself is Gaussian with mean as this function vector. and then covariance as this covariance matrix. So if you go back and see this video and read these sentences, maybe you'll get a little bit more clarity on how do you sample for a Gaussian process. Why is this important? Because this is the primary intuition behind, let's say I sample this point. Now I can sample a process which actually goes randomly like this. I can sample another process which goes randomly like this. Why can I sample this? Because I know that function f1, f2, f3 and all. This f1, f of x1, f of x2, f of x3 and all. I can sample any random thing that goes through this point. In fact, that is called Thompson sampling. We'll come back to it. Because I can do that, and if you have one more point, I have good information. There are two constraints. All those functions that goes through these points, now I constrain my approximation space to those functions. So let me first formally define this, and then I'll give some more intuition on this. Let the function f, which we want to actually approximate, that feasible set is very simple, which means that it is very well defined function. In the x domain, it is continuous and all that. Again, it is continuous, but it lacks special structure. For example, there is no concavity or convexity or any such restrictions. It is function is derivative free. We don't know anything about derivative. Again, here there are parallels, right? So it's derivative free means our evaluation of the gold content at location did not give us any gradient information. You just know that there is that ground truth at that point. There is no gradient information. You just need to assume some functional form. Again, if it's continuous, it's neither there's no special structure, neither concave nor convex. And drilling is costly. F is expensive to evaluate, and it may be noisy. We assume noiseless. That's okay. Okay. Now, assuming that I am at this stage, this is yet another intuitive diagram here. Let's say I'm in this orange line here, actually yellow line here. I don't know if it's yellow or orange. This colored line here. I want to actually decide which is the next point I want to sample. Now in X, if I already know that given that I am in this orange line, my maximal uncertainty is somewhere around here. Given depending on the sigma deviations, even if it's 1 sigma, 2 sigma, 3 sigma and all, 1 sigma deviation, the maximal deviation is here. So I would like to sample this point because that's what is a point which most uncertainty, which I have no idea of. So I can sample at this point. So I can keep sampling. So depending on whether I want to, if I know that I've already reached a point like this, I can do two things. I can explore more to see whether there are any more such peaks, or I can exploit more. For example, depending on my choice of epsilon, let's say I've sampled here 1, 2, 3 points. Out of all the 3 points, I've got one point which has got maximum gold content for me. That point is my f of x plus, and I actually have sampled so far. That is my maximum so far. This whole thing is my mean function so far, mu of t. Now I want to make sure that my the difference between my next point that I am going to sample, the next point x of t plus 1 should be the difference wherever this difference is maximal, wherever this uncertainty is maximal. So I go here and I sample. So I go here and I sample. I come back to this point. Now, if my epsilon value is very less, which means that I can just go explore this region around. But whereas if I just choose an epsilon value in this equation, which is very high, I kind of go around. I just kind of go around on a tour. I just want to see if there are any more maximas available somewhere else. This is a bimodal distribution, so I'm just trying to do more exploration. So one of this acquisition function is probability of improvement. There's another acquisition function which is called expected improvement. I'll skip this, but I'll just give the intuition in the next one. In the expected improvement also, you want to actually do a lot of exploitation with a low sigma, which is here. You can take a high sigma and do a lot of exploration. And if you actually take the probability of improvement value and the expected improvement value, you will get a bunch of curves. So what basically EI and PI does is this. Given you are at a certain point, this is your ground truth understanding as of now. You go either to the one that is improving your objective. You're kind of improving your objective. You're trying to maximize this tail probability, or you want to actually you're actually telling by how much you want to improve your objective. If I'm saying by how much you want to improve your objective, you're going to EI, which is expectation improvement. And if you just want to improve your objective, you're going to PI, probability of improvement. You're just trying to maximize that. There's another way you can do Thompson sampling. This was the point that I was talking about. You can sample a bunch of curves, and if you look at the variance between the bunch of curves, it's the highest here. It's pretty okay here, but it's kind of the highest here. It's also very high here. So you actually go here based on the variance. You actually sample here, and then based on the variance of the remainder of the region, you go and sample in that region. This is called Thompson sampling. Then there's something called UCB, the upper confidence bound. Again, you take your mean of your posterior, you sample somewhere around this, but then you also do some exploitation based on this variance. How much you want to exploit depending on your lambda, that will change. This is the intuition behind UCB, which is the upper confidence bound. And there's a GP upper confidence bound, which has a several different term. But the whole idea is these are the different exploitation strategies of a function that you don't know. Which is the function that we don't know? This is the function that we don't know. So based on this uncertainty around this region, we are jumping into this region and we are evaluating this point. Depending on which region we jump into, what is the logic of jumping? Either we use the upper confidence bound or expected improvement or probability of improvement or do a Thompson sampling. All these are strategies to explore and exploit. Why do we do this? Because we don't know this underlying distribution. We are keeping on doing this. Now it should have really struck a chord with people who are already adept with reinforcement learning. Whenever we actually do a reinforcement learning, we keep sampling. We actually sometimes do an epsilon greedy solution. We actually sample in a path which maximizes our return, but 10 to 20% of the time, we also sample for some diversity. And that is kind of the exploration versus exploitation trade-off. Initially, that epsilon will be very high because you want to sample all different paths. You don't want to get stuck in a local minima. But then you eventually want to, as more and more information comes, you want to exploit more. So your epsilon will kind of gracefully reduce. And that's what happens in reinforcement learning. All these strategies are again used in reinforcement learning, which are used in Bayesian optimization. So that's the whole idea about Bayesian optimization. I'll just quickly go through one last code demo. Okay, I don't want to do Bayesian process, but let me just, yeah. Yeah, let me just show this very quickly. Let's say I have an application where I have an XGBoost model and I want to do hyperparameter optimization for this XGBoost model. Typically how we do it, we do a grid search, and we can do a cross validation, either n-fold cross validation or 5-fold, 2-fold, whatever fold that we choose. We divide our data set into multiple of this, and we actually take n-1 folds as training, testing as that nth fold, and we keep repeating this and average that, and then we'll get some kind of generalizability. That's the whole point about cross validation. But in terms of which is the best hyperparameter to validate, we can do a bunch of things. We can do random search, we can put a grid search, and we can we can do a completely random search. But the other thing we can do is we can put that cross validation thing as a function. Here we can put the cross validation score as a function of parameters. Let's say here the parameters of the XGBoost model is what I chose, and you can do a Bayesian optimization of that. You can select a certain acquisition function. So the model that I assume is the surrogate model that I assumed is a Gaussian process, and the acquisition type is expectation improvement, which means that not only I want to improve, but I also want to say how much I can improve expectedly. And there's a little bit of a noise, and I want to maximize this, and I can actually do this whole thing. The setup is very simple. Just send these parameters along with the scikit-learn parameters of XGBoost. The CV score function is the one that you're going to optimize. So you put all these things. This function CV score is actually optimized for these parameters. And finally, you get, after everything runs, if you had done random search, you would have got a result something like what you see on the red. For Bayesian optimization with a lesser number of runs, I think 25 versus 20 or something like that, you get a better solution. And that's because it kind of intelligently proceeds based on your uncertainty information. That's the whole point about the Bayesian optimization. Okay, so yeah, the references, and I will take some questions if there are. Okay, are dominating points comparable to support vectors? I think we have already. Are we choosing 95% confidence intervals here? This is regarding which slide? If you can just tell me. The question was, are we choosing 95% confidence intervals here? Can I get some more context to that? Like which slide was it? Okay, I'm not able to exactly get that which slide I could get the question. Maybe I'm guessing that it would be related to this slide or something. How do we get this variance?
Sai, could you suggest some nice book which is more contemporary on this topic and your previous topic as well, Bayesian learning?
For
but not old.
Yeah.
Some new books. I was checking on Amazon. There is Professor Deb of MSU, as you were saying, but he has very old books. Any new contemporary books for optimization and also Bayesian, your last Sunday's topic?
Yeah, so one of the good books for there are two good books for Bayesian. One is Andrew Gelman's book, Bayesian Data Analysis. I think there was a recent edition also on that. It contains Bayesian modeling, Bayesian inference, Bayesian optimization. It contains a bunch of topics. There's another book by Richard McElrea. I can type that spelling in your.
Question is, we are an AI lab, right? So we have a product team now. So how important it is for our community to go much deeper into the mathematics, the way you have been presenting, and it seems very intense. And
Yeah.
I mean, should we? Yeah, I have some confusion. Or should we more be on product side of things, or more on research and deep mathematics of the algorithm side of things? What do you think?
So one thing is, if we want to do anything related to, even in a product, if you want to do something, we need to understand. We don't need to understand all the gory details of the mathematics. Why is that lemma? Why is that lemma true? And that is not needed. But general concept behind, if you have a black box, how do I optimize that black box using, let's say, a Bayesian optimization? What kind of assumptions go into it? Those kind of math is probably needed, because then we can just wrap in, okay, in real world these are the situations, so we need a Gaussian process prior, so we need to actually give a handle for the user to insert a Gaussian process prior, because he might be doing Bayesian optimization of this way. And by the way, because he's doing Bayesian optimization, he will also be doing exploration exploitation. So we need to give these bunch of methods. And why is one method better over the other? Maybe I'll give only two methods. If I'm just restricted to give only two methods, because in my product development lifecycle, I've got only the time to do two of these six methods. If that is the case, what you see on the screen, I would probably go by expectation improvement and upper confidence bound. The other ones I will not give a handle to my user in my product. So just to that extent, we need to understand what are the different strategies, and intuitively why some strategies work, why some don't. Like you said, some of these methods are a little older. I don't want to be sitting and coding some old multi-objective optimization rule like method of multipliers or weighted objective function. I don't need to code all those things now, because nobody is literally going to use any of them. It's only textbook stuff. That's why I did not even talk about them.
Can you please go to the reference slide?
Sure.
You have a reference slide? Yeah.
So I've given a lot of references, but for Bayesian optimization, this one is pretty good. One of the papers from DistilPub. This is pretty good. And for the other thing that you asked was multi-objective. For multi-objective, there is a Purdue thing. Yeah, this one. Lecture 9. It's a very good. It's a very good reference for that.
Okay. Audience, any other questions? Yes, Sai, if you don't mind, on the global lab group, if you can share some nice book names, that will be
Sure.
useful. On the lab group itself, you can send.
Sure.
And
Can I type here in the chat also? Like, is it possible?
you can, but better to send on the WhatsApp group, right, to the whole community.
Okay,
So,
sure. I'll do that.
no, my question remains. So, should we be buying those books you suggested and going through them, or we can just read some of these papers and have a bit of knowledge on some of the topics?
For Bayesian, you better, so if you want to go any serious in Bayesian, I would suggest either buy the book or go into a proper course like, I think Fonnesbeck, I guess I'm not getting the name wrong. Fonnesbeck is another good course. There's a good course given by him. So that's also a good course. And apart from that,
No,
I've given.
actually, our hope is that with your help, we'll be making some of these courses, right? So that is the plan, at least we discussed before. So we might be making some of these courses with your help, of course, if we
Sure.
can.
Yeah, so yeah, we can do that. But all I'm saying is, if you want to go really be on the cutting edge of it, GitHub is the only way. But the books actually give you a very fundamental approach knowledge. Typically, when you buy a book, if you can also go through the theory, try out some exercises, you will get some concepts. Nowadays, I don't know many people even do that or not, but yeah, people like watching videos and understanding stuff and keep going. That's also another way. But most of the real world problems need exploration, exploitation. There's a lot of uncertainty, and it's all multi-objective, and it's all high dimensional, it's all non-convex. And that's why these 5 concepts I touched clearly today, unless we have a deep appreciation of this, we will not understand the complexity of our space.
Right. Audience, any other comments or questions? As you can see, Sai is a deep specialist in these nuanced topics. So it is quite a privilege to be able to hear his thoughts and expertise. Uh, but yes, I cannot say that everything I understood today, but I tried to. But at some point, I think I started glossing over it. It's quite a lot of advanced stuff. And there are some good comments coming. Thanks for an excellent presentation. And any other comments, folks? So we are hoping Sai will do many such sessions, and over time, we'll be able to understand a lot of this content. Because just in the first time, it's quite advanced stuff. I mean, I think I was very strong in maths when I was in high school and preparing for JEE exam. But what has happened since then, there's a steady decline in my mathematical intuition. Like most people probably.
I think in the future I will make things which are dedicated to one topic. This was like a lot of topics together. Now, if you take one topic, then people will have a much better appreciation, because that then we'll deal with that topic for a long time.
So there are other questions coming. I'm a deep learning beginner. Will I need to learn more maths? See, I'll tell you something. In CellStat, we teach MLDL courses. There is some maths, but it is not as intense as what you saw today. It is much simpler. I mean, this is very deeply mathematical and advanced session. But in the MLDL courses, I think we have some maths, but it is definitely not to this extent. But over time, for long-term AI eminence and expertise, you will have to probably, do more of this. But yes, in MLDL courses themselves, you don't have to worry about this much maths. So there's basic maths involved. And some people are asking how I can be in touch with Sai. So Sai, if you are all right, I can share your number with the people who are interested. Okay.
Sure, absolutely. And I just replied Raghunathan also.
Right.
Yeah, as Vivek said, it's not that's the typical deep learning is not this complex. But whatever I said is still true. There are millions of parameters, very high dimensional, non-convex space, and especially every time the data set batch optimization happens, when one batch of data comes, a different non-convex space is built, and then your stochastic gradient descent optimizes your weights for that non-convex space. And then when the next batch comes, the non-convex space changes, and then the gradient updates are again happening for that surface. And this is stochastic in nature. That actually converges a little faster. But then the math itself is very simple. So you just take the gradient at any previous iteration and just apply a learning rate over the new update and just add the update. That's all. That's all the math that is needed to simply understand deep learning stuff. The next question was from, I think that's it. That was the only question I had.
Yeah. Okay. So any other questions or comments, folks? Okay, thanks a lot, audience, for joining. Thanks so much, Sai, for a very intense session once again. And frankly, I think Sai will have to do a series of sessions. In first time, I am doubtful that myself and others can grasp all of the information which was provided. But just like in cases of advanced topics like reinforcement learning, we have seen, we'll have to do these few times, and then slowly many of the concepts will start settling in the mind. So it does need a series of regular sessions, just like we saw in RL and few other complex areas. First time, I don't think anybody can grasp so much stuff so easily. So thanks once again, fantastic stuff, and good comments are coming on the chat as well. Look forward to your next session already. And with that, I will say good night to all of you, and have a good day based on your time zone around the world.
Sure.